You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Good Question Podcast. I have Mark David Hall. He's the author of a book I recently got a complimentary copy of, thank you, called Proclaim Liberty Throughout All the Land, How Christianity Has Advanced Freedom and Equality for All Americans. Very, very interesting. He's a distinguished professor of politics at Herbert Hoover, part of the honors program there. So we're going to talk about his book and his work. So Mark, thank you for coming.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
If you would, tell me a bit about your background and what's your position at Herbert Hoover like right now, and then we'll get into the book itself.
Sure. So I earned a PhD in government in 1993, and I've taught for many years. I'm actually the Hoover Distinguished Professor at George Fox University. So I teach at George Fox, teaching politics. I'm actually moving to Regent University in the fall. They're starting a new PhD program, and so I'd be very, very happy to chat with any of your listeners if they're interested in learning more about that. So I have written or edited about a dozen books, mostly on the American founding. And my last book, Did America Have a Christian Founding, was my first book for the general reading public. And this book, Proclaim Liberty Throughout All the Land, is somewhat of a sequel to that. It includes 3 chapters that I wanted to have in the last book, but I just didn't have room to put them in the last book. And so basically all my work looks at the intersection of law and religion and politics in the American context.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, what does it mean to have a degree in government? What did you learn that you feel was hopefully useful to you getting that degree?
Yes, I focused on political theory and constitutional law, and I certainly learned a great deal about those things in graduate school, and I've continued to learn about them ever since, and that primarily what I've been teaching, and so it's really useful to have that graduate degree for teaching. Otherwise, I'm not sure there's a whole lot of practical applications. If I wanted to do something more practical, I probably would have gotten a law degree in litigated cases or something like that.
It's too bad Congress doesn't have a degree in government. They probably don't even have an elementary degree in it.
That is unfortunate, yes.
Tell me about what led to the creation of your previous book and then this book.
The previous book is aimed at decimating myths that are very, very common. You find them in academic literature and popular literature. And by myth here, I mean a false story. So the idea that most of America's founders were deists, that they wanted the strict separation of church and state, that America has a godless constitution. And so I lined up each chapter with about 15 quotations from very prominent people saying those sorts of things. And then I'd like to think I absolutely demolish the claims which are simply untrue. And so, as I said, the current book was meant to be a sequel to that book. The last book came out in 2019. In between 2019 and the publication of this book, the New York Times 1619 Project came out, and it really just sort of infuriated me. It basically wants to redefine American history as being solely about slavery and racism. And to the extent to which it treats Christianity as a repressive force, an oppressive force. And so in this current book, I try to disabuse people of that myth. I recognize, of course, as I must, that some Christians have in fact defended slavery and sexism and racism and poverty with biblical arguments or theological arguments. I don't deny that, but I argue that on balance, Christianity has been a force for the advancement of liberty and equality for all Americans. And so I try to tell that tale from the Pilgrims to the current day.
Yeah, I think people that naysay it, have pretty much little to zero experience with it. I mean, a friend of mine, they had a big seminar at his church and how to have a better marriage. How could that be bad? And if let's say the 10 Commandments, don't kill, don't steal, don't covet, but how is that bad? But people somehow just, wrap it all up in one word, religion or Christianity or whatever it may be, and say bad, bad, bad. And they have no experience.
I think that's exactly right. And especially when we're talking about academics, I'm an academic. I'm not saying all academics are like this, but it does tend to be the case that academics are fairly secular people, and they tend to be pretty progressive politically. And so this combination, I think, generally leads them to either ignore religion or to treat it as negative force, something that has to be overcome. either by maybe being smacked by the Enlightenment or by embracing progressive manifestations of Christianity. But again, I think you can make a good case from the Pilgrims through the American founders, through the abolitionists up to the present day, that really Christians acting in the Christian convictions have been a force for a great deal of good throughout American history.
Well, being an academic, like you said, you seem to be more of a rarity. How do you function in academic circles? Do you have a lot of pushback on what you do, or how does it work?
I get a lot of pushback. My first dozen books or so were all with university presses, and I published with Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press, University of Notre Dame. And I say that just that I've been able to get my scholarship out there and publish in peer-reviewed presses, some of the best presses. And what I have to do is just be so very careful in my scholarship that even though there's inclination to dismiss what I'm arguing, that it's really, really hard for academics to be able to undermine my arguments. And so what I've attempted to do with these last two books is to really give these same sorts of arguments, but in a very accessible fashion so that anyone who reads books can just sit down and pick it up and read it, hopefully fairly easily.
So what are some of the elements in your book that readers have found surprising or interesting or useful?
Probably my favorite chapter is a chapter on the founders and slavery. I think even people who are right of center buy into the myth that the founders were a bunch of hypocrites because they created the Declaration of Independence with the wonderful words about all men being created equal, but they owned slaves. And so they're just a bunch of hypocrites. One of the things I show in that chapter is, first of all, the vast majority of white Americans never owned an enslaved person. America's founders, the civic leaders in the era, were better off than your average American. So maybe about half of them owned an enslaved person at one time or the other. And yet many of them were coming to recognize that slavery was an evil, horrible institution that needed to be abolished. And so a number of founders actually freed their slaves. John Dickinson was at one point the largest slave owner in Delaware. He freed his slaves. John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the United States, owned a few enslaved Americans throughout his lifetime, ended up freeing the last of them, and then as governor of New York signed a law putting slavery on the road to extinction. Ben Franklin, James Wilson, each owned slaves, and they freed them. Franklin went on to become president of the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society. And so, again, I think I make a good argument that these founders are coming, many of the founders are coming to recognize that slavery is an evil institution. They're coming to this conclusion because of their Christian convictions, and they're taking very, very specific steps. If they owned slaves, they freed them. 8 states abolished slavery or put it on the road to extinction between 1776 and 1804. The Northwest Ordinance prohibited the expansion of slavery into the Northwest Territory. And so I think readers will probably be quite surprised, and pleasantly so, by that chapter showing the founders really were against slavery, taking significant steps to end it.
So what kind of feedback have you gotten from readers of the book? Are they surprised? Is this anything new? Are they saying, no, this can't be? Like what kind of responses do you get?
Yeah, so I do get people who are very troubled by that argument I just mentioned because they're just so sure that America's founders were a bunch of hypocrites. But again, I've done my homework, and so it's real hard for them to effectively push back against that argument. The chapter on the Puritans argues that they weren't, in fact, intolerant theocrats, that they created some of the most Republican institutions the world had ever seen. People usually don't care as much about that. The chapter on the abolitionists, those Americans who fought the institution of slavery in the 19th century, people generally like that chapter. They know that these folks existed and that they were on the side of good. My arguments for religious liberty get probably the most pushback on the political left today. I think especially academics have turned against religious liberty, at least with respect to conservative views, such as a florist or baker who believes he can't participate in a same-sex wedding ceremony, or a medical professional who believes he or she can't perform an abortion. We used to protect these sorts of things pretty robustly as a matter of religious liberty, and yet today the left has turned against that, and it's very tempting to label someone making the sort of arguments that I'm making as sexist or a bigot, and that certainly has happened, and unfortunately, people aren't willing to engage in rational debate about these subjects.
Well, what do you do when someone just throws an epithet at you, and do you ask them if they've actually read things, or do you respond, or like what have you seen as a better way to respond to people that just, use one or two words to try to summarize everything about a person or a cause?
Yeah, I try to remain winsome. I certainly don't, throw anything back at them, and I'll usually ask them to elaborate. What is it about the book that you think is an error? Where am I wrong? I'm open for correction. Please let me know. And again, usually, even if they've read the book, they don't have the ability to engage the arguments in a straightforward fashion.
So what have you learned from researching your books and writing them about the founding of, the United States? And, how is this, the initial character and spirit in which it was founded, is that continuing, and how and where?
Well, that's a great question. Thank you. So I probably didn't learn a whole lot in writing this book, because this book, I was pulling from things I had published previously, not cutting and pasting, but I've done a lot of research for my university press books. And so the territory was pretty familiar to me. One of the most important insights, I think, is that the founders embraced a view of religious liberty that was very robust, and that applied to all people. I think it's a very important insight that today some people on the right aren't willing to recognize. Something like 28% of Americans say that Muslims shouldn't be able to build mosques on the same terms that Christians can build churches. Well, America's founders would not have accepted that, right? They passed a constitution that prohibited religious tests for federal office. When anti-federalists objected that a Jew or a Muslim or an atheist could hold federal office, the Federalists had to say, yes, that's right. They said it probably won't happen. In the late 18th century, about 98% of Americans of European descent are Protestant, 2% Roman Catholic. There's only about 2,500 or so Jews in North America. So it seemed very unlikely at the time, but still, I think it's important to recognize that this principle was there. I quote several times George Washington's letter to the Hebrew synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, making it crystal clear that Jews, just like Catholics, just like Protestants, have the right to worship God according to the dictates of conscience. And it's a natural right. It's not a gift of the government. So today, oftentimes, when I talk to more progressive audience, I try to remind them of the importance of religious liberty. And when I talk to more conservative audiences, I try to remind them that religious liberty is for all. If we hope to honor the founders' views, we must insist that every American has the right to worship God according to the dictates of conscience, and to act upon religious convictions whenever possible.
How have you seen this, the intention of the founding fathers and the whole underpinning of the United States? How have you seen it change? And let's say recently, the past, 5 to 7 years, have you seen it change more, or what are you observing?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think America's founders created a national government that was only supposed to do a relatively few things. These things are articulated very well in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Unfortunately, since the 1930s, we've just blown past these constitutional constraints, and the federal government's involved in so many things the founders never would have intended it to be involved with. And I'd love to see that dialed back, but I'm not very optimistic that's going to happen. One major commitment of America's founders is they were just absolutely committed to what they believed was the reality that if you want to have a Republican form of government, you had to have a moral people. And if you wanted to have a moral people, you had to have a religious people. And by religion, they mean Christianity. Well, today we see the rise of the nuns over the last 2 decades or so. That is Americans who say they have no religious affiliation. Something like 35% of Americans are now in that category. And I think, in all honesty, America's founders would be fairly concerned about that reality. And that might have something to do with the very contentious public discourse that we have nowadays, where people on the left are inclined to demonize people on the right and vice versa. I think that's very, very disheartening. And I just wish we could learn how to treat each other with respect and dignity. And I think, we just have to move in that direction.
Why do you think there's an acceleration lately, meaning the past, let's say, 5 to 10 years of this this divisiveness and this division? Like, where is it coming from, if you could assign a source?
If I had to pick one source, it would probably be social media. I think that people get on social media and then they tend to surround themselves with people who hold similar views to them. And so conservatives get together and tweet to each other and Facebook to each other and make fun of the liberals and vice versa. And it's really easy to do this through the relatively anonymous online platforms like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and that sort of thing. So I think social media is a huge, huge reason for the very sad discourse that we see nowadays. I'm sorry the words aren't coming to me well today.
No, it's okay. What do you think would happen if our government propagandized, pushed, let's say, the 10 Commandments on everyone constantly, like they did with COVID for the past 4 years? What do you think would happen?
Well, that's interesting.
If all the media were constantly harping on it and talking about why you should follow it, and just everywhere they were pushing this. And it's just a thought experiment, but what do you think would happen?
Yeah, well, of course, Texas recently considered a bill that would have required the Ten Commandments to be posted prominently in every schoolroom, I believe, in every public school in Texas. I'm not optimistic that would do too much good, in all honesty. I believe in the Ten Commandments. I attempt to follow them as best I can, but I'm not sure that simply posting them within schools or having the government propagandize them would be all that useful. Probably the main thing we need to do is parents need to be instilling morality into their children. Churches need to be preaching the gospel and teaching morality and reminding people that we can be better. And by churches, I mean broadly, churches, mosques, synagogues, all religious entities should be promoting morality, public morality.
Yeah, it would just be interesting if the government suddenly got super interested in it and pushed it as much as they're doing with everything else. I think it may have a big effect. People seem to be followers, a lot of them, and whatever they're told to think and feel and do, they do by the media.
Yeah, it's interesting. We could think back to COVID, right? You suddenly had a lot of people that followed what the government was pushing. We had a lot of people that reacted fairly negatively towards that, and there was a lot of pushback on it. So, yeah, I tend to not look to the government for solutions to the extent to which governments at any level should try that sort of thing. It should probably be the state or local governments. But again, I'm much more keen on families and voluntary organizations and churches trying to instill morality rather than the government.
No, I'm with you. I mean, it definitely easily could go wrong and be corrupt. I just thought it would be a funny thought experiment. Unfortunately, they seem to do the opposite.
No, that's right.
So now that this book is out, what do you feel like is next? What do you need to communicate to audiences from here? Will it be useful? What's the topic of perhaps your next book if it's inside you?
Yes, I've been spending the year at Princeton at the James Madison program working on a book on American Christian nationalism. And Christian nationalism has been in the news a great deal over the last couple of years. Since 2006, there's a steady stream of books talking about how you have these Christian nationalists that are trying to take over the country and oppress everyone else. And maybe it's 51.9% of Americans are these scary Christian nationalists. I think it's just a ridiculous literature. And so I'm highly critical of that. But then over the last year, you've had a couple of Christians that have come out and say, no, Christian nationalism is a good thing. We should be Christian nationalists. And I think those arguments are profoundly problematic as well. And so I critique those. Finally, I lay out what I think Christian nationalism actually is and address that. So basically, I contend that Christian nationalism is a desire to privilege Christianity above all other faiths, perhaps by having Congress declare the United States of America to be a Christian country. I think that flies in the face of our constitutional tradition, and I think there's good moral and even biblical arguments against that sort of favoritism. So that book will hopefully be out in time for the Republican primaries and the general election next year. Right now, every major Republican candidate has already been called a Christian nationalist, and so I'm hoping people will want some guidance. What is a Christian nationalist? What should we think about it? Is it really, in fact, the case that Ron DeSantis is one of these evil, scary Christian nationalists?
Yeah, I've heard the term. I didn't even know what they're talking about. So I guess that's what it's defined as, right? Someone that wants to put that above everything else in government.
Well, the problem with the literature is the major proponents of this idea describe it as an absolutely toxic mess of racism and sexism and homophobism and militarism, just every bad ism you can think of wrapped up with Christianity. And I think really it's just a ridiculous argument. I think there probably are some people out there in America who hold these sort of toxic views, the sort of people who showed up in Charlottesville for the Unite the Right rally. But I think you can count them on a relatively few hands. Certainly not 51.9% of the American population fully or partially supporting this toxic stew.
Yeah, it's weird. It's just putting a label on something and making up out of whole cloth, it sounds like. It's weird.
Yeah, pretty much is. If your listeners are interested, I've probably published a half dozen online essays about Christian nationalism. You can just Google my name, Mark David Hall, Christian nationalism, and some of the essays are bound to pop up.
It seems like Christians are being attacked. I don't know, it just seems like it's from the news in more places more recently. Like in Israel, it looks like there's legislation that would make it illegal to be Christian or to profess any faith, Christian faith. What are you seeing happening worldwide right now?
Yeah, that's I'm not familiar with the legislation in Israel. Certainly think it is a case that Christians are vilified generally in Hollywood. If there's an overtly Christian character on a TV show or movie, it's pretty clear that's going to be a bad guy. It's never an upstanding, noble person. I think the political left has long been highly critical of at least conservative Christians. I've already mentioned the attacks on religious liberty. It just strikes me as ridiculous. When there's like one florist in all of Eastern Washington who won't participate in the same-sex wedding ceremony, the weight of the ACLU and the Attorney General of the state have to come down on her like a ton of bricks, right? Why not just live and let live? There's dozens, hundreds of florists willing to provide that. And yet there's this new orthodoxy, I think, coming from the left that you have to be 100% sold into the progressive political agenda, and there's no room for a variation from that. So yeah, I think that especially in darker blue states like Washington and Oregon and California, Christians are being discriminated against and being targeted in many ways.
Well, why? Where is this coming from? Is it just things are just changing in that direction for some reason, or is there another reason?
I think, again, there's this tendency to tar at least conservative Christians as intolerant theocrats. We think of The Handmaid's Tale or something like that. There certainly is an absolute belief that you cannot deviate from the LGBTQ agenda, that you have to call people by their desired pronouns and that sort of thing. And it tends to be citizens of faith, not just Christians. I think you'll find this among Orthodox Jews, conservative Muslims, who say, no, we aren't going to pretend a man is a woman or a woman is a man. And that runs straight, it flies in the face of where most progressive Americans are today. And so, again, especially if you're in a dark blue state, you're going to get trammeled. And we see this happening far too often. Now, if you're in a nice red state like Alabama or Mississippi, that probably won't happen. But in the more progressive states, absolutely it will.
Yeah, it just seems like, I don't know, I guess I'd characterize it as a sickness that has come upon society. I don't know why or where it came from, but that's just kind of how I feel about it. It looks like you're more balanced about the approach, but it's just strange. I just don't know why that, I'm in my late 40s and all of a sudden things are like inside out and upside down. I just don't know why. It's very weird.
No, that's right. I can actually illustrate this pretty well. So a fellow named William Brennan, a Supreme Court justice, came up with an excellent test for protecting religious liberty in 1963. It gave it a very robust protection. Unfortunately, the United States Supreme Court abandoned that test in 1990. And within a couple of years, Congress and the president came together, 97-3 in the Senate, unanimously in the House, and passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act to better protect religious liberty throughout the nation. Again, think about that. Everyone, Democrats and Republicans, could come together in 1993. The law was signed, the bill was signed into law by President Bill Clinton. You don't see anything like that today. You see absolutely no desire to protect a conservative cake baker, a conservative florist, a conservative medical professional from the American left. They have to get on board. And if they won't get on board, they have to leave their profession. There's just no tolerance at all. And I do find that very disheartening, and I wish it wasn't so, but I'm afraid it is.
What do you see as coming over the next, let's say, 5 years in the West and in the U.S. in terms of, culturally and with religion? Do you think things are going to get more intolerant towards religion, or where do you see it going?
Unfortunately, we have an excellent Supreme Court nowadays with a 6-person conservative majority. And so I think the U.S. Supreme Court is going to be very good on protecting religious liberty and not go down the sort of silly paths that the courts went down in the 1970s with respect to the Establishment Clause type issues. My guess is that the nuns, NES, will continue to rise, and the percentage of Americans who are faithful citizens will continue to decline. I'm not too very optimistic about our public discourse. I think they'll probably continue to get rougher and rougher as people demonize each other. I guess the main thing I could just encourage is, especially speaking to my own faith community, to Christians, I'd say, look, Christians have excellent reasons for treating everyone with respect and dignity, and we should lead the way in this issue. We shouldn't vilify our political opponents. We should love them and treat them with dignity, even as we might raise objections to, say, pro-choice positions or anti-religious liberty positions. And hopefully, if some Americans start behaving in a more civil manner, that might have an impact on others who don't share that faith tradition. But I'm not terribly optimistic, I have to say.
Well, very good. Mark, what's the best way for people to find out more about your work? Where can they go? And then if you would restate the title of your most recent book so people can go and buy it if they wish.
Sure, thank you. So my wife made a nice authors page for me, markdavidhall.org. It has information about this book and other books. And this recent book is Proclaim Liberty Throughout All the Land, How Christianity Has Advanced Freedom and Equality for All Americans. It's published by Post Hill Press, and probably the easiest thing to do is just go on Amazon and purchase it there.
Okay, very good. Well, Mark, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Oh, certainly. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.